Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handi Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Sulky, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. Brother, it's so easy with Brother at your side. And QuiltCut, easy fabric cutting for quilters. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Carpetras, and with me today we are very honored to have the Judy Martin, renowned quilt designer and author Judy Martin. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's really an honor to have you.
Thank you.
And you're here today to tell us about your tips for successful log cabin quilts.
That's
correct?
right.
Okay.
I thought from the beginning that log cabin quilts were simple to make, being just squares and rectangles. However, I've learned that some people find them flummoxing and would prefer to do anything other than log cabin. And so I'm here to show you some tips that will help you to get past that if that's stopping you from making.
Is it because of all the
quilts.
there's so many pieces?
I think so. I think that it's the seam allowance that gives people problems. You know, that they're not having their patchwork come out the right size.
Okay, great. Well, we've got some tips to talk about, but before that, let's take a look at a couple of the quilts that you brought with you. These are some of your gorgeous log cabin quilts here. Why don't you tell us what we're looking at?
Okay, this is Aspen Log Cabin. It's from my forthcoming book, Extraordinary Log Cabin Quilts. Mm-hmm. And this is a little variation of the traditional log cabin. It has logs in 3 values, light, medium, and dark. And I've added the illusion of a curve made strictly from rectangles and squares. And this kind of thing is what you'll be able to do with the tips that I'm giving you today.
That's gorgeous.
And then this other quilt is also from Extraordinary Log Cabin Quilts, and it is called Lakeshore Log Cabin. And this one is 2 values, but you'll notice the light here is a pale pink and peach. It's not white. And then the darks aren't deep darks like black or brown. They're bright pink and bright orange.
Right.
And still, both of these quilts are made with log shapes, just rectangles that are in graduated sizes.
Okay.
Okay. And that's pretty much what defines a log cabin quilt for me, because I've been experimenting with new variations. These still, to me, fall within the log cabin category.
Absolutely. I mean, they're laid out differently, but when you look at it closely, you can see they're logs.
That's right, and they make different secondary patterns too, just like your traditional log cabin quilt does. Not necessarily that design, the same designs that the others make, but some of them do.
Okay. So what's your first tip for us?
Well, I wanted to talk first about your fabric selection, because that's critical in a log cabin quilt. You want your light values to blend with each other, but contrast with the dark values. And you want the dark values to blend with each other as well. So I select fabric from my stash, augmented with things that I buy, because you can't run out of your stash.
Nope, can't do that.
And so I end up laying the fabric in an array like this with the fold showing. It's a neat way to do it. And one line for the lights and one for the darks. And my darks here are green, brown, and blue, and my lights are cream, white, and taupe, and tan, and beige, and things like that. And you can get a better idea of how you did with picking your values by looking at a reducing glass, which you can buy at the hardware store.
Oh,
and
so it's just a peephole?
It's a peephole,
Oh,
a door peephole.
Okay.
And you look through it, and it makes things look smaller, so you see your mistakes in value.
Okay.
And I can see here that this is too dark for the others, and so is this one. So I'm going to remove it. This one's borderline, but I want a little variation in there, so I'm leaving it.
Okay.
And also, this is too dark for my darks, and this one and this one are too light. They're too close to the colors of the lights.
I see. Okay.
And then I think I have a pretty good revised mix here. And that's all you've got to do.
That's great.
It really helps to have a reducing glass.
I'm going to go out and get one today.
All right. They're really cheap too.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Now I want to show you another thing that I do that's a little different from other people.
Okay.
I had a very stern home ec teacher in 7th grade.
I think we all did.
And, and she, you know, taught us to lay out our dress patterns on the straight grain, being the lengthwise grain, parallel to the selvage. And I was afraid to use the crosswise grain when I started quilt making because of my home ec teacher, I think. And so now I was resisting learning rotary cutting because people did that on the crosswise
Right, so
grain.
much of it is assuming that you're cutting across the
And
fold.
it didn't occur to me right away that I could just cut it on the lengthwise grain.
Okay.
But you can, and because I have so much fabric in my stash, I'm going to win that contest, the one who dies with the most fabric.
Okay.
Anyway, because I have so much fabric, it's helpful for me to buy just fat quarters or half yards.
Okay.
And so all of my fabrics are 18 inches long, unless I'm buying a backing or something that I want to be longer than that. And the straight grain that's lengthwise is much more stable than the crosswise. Here, this is the selvage is trimmed off, and this is a lengthwise grain, and it's quite firm. The crosswise grain is quite stretchy. And it doesn't matter at all on a right triangle or a square, a lot of the things you do patchwork. But in a rectangle, that could be, you know, 9 or 10 inches long and only an inch wide. You want the long side to be on the lengthwise grain for the most stability.
Okay.
That will help you in your sewing to keep things from having too much ease that you can make
Right,
mistakes
so then your
with.
corners stop meeting and things get
Right,
off.
and you keep your blocks the size that they're designed to be.
Okay, all
All
right,
right.
great.
Then, you don't have to make much of a change in order to cut on the lengthwise grain. As I said, it's a very simple change. You just cut your strips parallel to the selvage instead. And I cut my strips down into log lengths or patches. And in order to keep them straight and organized, I put them in either cutlery trays or drawer organizers. And I make a label, such as this, with a Post-it note that lists the patch letter and the dimensions.
That's great.
And I just stick it in. Each compartment has its own label, and I'm all organized, and I only deal with the next step at a time.
Well, that just can only help to expedite the whole thing, so you're not sitting there thinking and trying to remember which pile is which length. You can just go straight to what you need and just zoom along from there.
Right.
This is a great
It's very, very
time-saving
easy.
trick.
And I don't bother to count when I'm cutting out. I just cut. So I always have a lot of logs left over, and then I start my next quilt by going through my logs. Then I can keep, I have a lot of these trays and they stack nicely too. So I just stack my leftovers in them too.
That's great.
So the next thing you're going to want to do is sew your patches together. And this is the part that's scary for some people, because if your seam allowance isn't right, it's not going to go well
Right.
in a log cabin. And I think that a log cabin might have a little more take-up than some other patchwork, because you're building from a corner or the center instead of sewing in rows. And so I have this test that I've devised for getting your log cabin seam allowance, the perfect scant quarter for a log cabin.
Okay, so even before you start to piece your quilt,
Right.
you run this test.
I do.
Okay.
And even if you think your seam allowance is right, try this.
Okay.
Okay? First you cut 9 squares. They can be the same fabric. They're 1.5 inch squares.
Okay.
And then you cut 1 rectangle that's 1.5 by 9.5. You sew your squares in a row, so you have a unit like this. And you finger press the seam allowances so that they're all going in one direction. And then you take your rectangle and you lay it over this pieced unit and see how you did. And I'm off by a little bit here.
So would you adjust your seam allowance
I
based
would.
on that? Okay.
I would. And
You want it right.
when your
perfectly
seam
aligned.
allowance is right, you're going to have the squares and the rectangles ending even with each other on both ends.
Okay.
When your seam allowance is too deep, which is the most common error, rectangle will be extending beyond the squares. In this case, I have it extending about a 1/4 inch beyond. And I did this on purpose to make an exaggerated error. When your seam allowance is too shallow, the squares extend beyond the rectangle. And what do you do then? The reason I have 9 squares is that makes 8 seams, and 8 seams each affect 2 fabrics, so that's 16 seam allowances that we're dealing with. So that if you were off, for example, by a whole inch here, your error, you need to move your seam allowance guide by a 1/16 of an inch.
Right.
All right, you're probably not going to be an inch off. You're not even going to be a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch or maybe an 1/8 or less probably.
Right.
And so a 1/4 inch would be a 64th of an inch that you need to adjust your seam allowance. An 1/8 of an inch would be 128th of an inch. So we're talking about threads.
Right, right. 1, 2 threads.
1 or 2 threads. But it adds up.
Sure
and your
does.
whole your quilt could be inches smaller.
Absolutely, yeah.
Or bigger.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
So get your seam allowance right, and
then you're off to the races.
you're off to the races.
Yeah.
You can do the log cabins that you've longed to make for a long time.
So if we do have to make an adjustment to our seam allowance, then
This is a throat plate from a sewing machine, and I use electrical tape. It's easier for me to see than masking tape, and
Okay.
It's less gummy. And I just put it a thread's width or 2 threads width or whatever I've determined closer to the needle if my seam allowance is too deep, and farther from the needle if it was too shallow. So I
And the
move
less-
it from what I had used to make the sample,
okay.
just a thread.
Okay, and the less gummy aspect is good because this is something that you're
I leave on my
presumably-
sewing machine for a long time.
Yeah, but you might be having to readjust it here
Right.
and there. You never know.
Right, and sometimes the fabric running up against it will, it'll start to fray and you get gummy.
Okay,
there. So
okay. These
Well,
are
I
all
like doing that.
fantastic tips. Thank you so much for sharing them
You're
for how we
very
can make
welcome.
our successful log cabin quilts. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next time. Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handi Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Sulky, express yourself with sulky and create with confidence. Brother, it's so easy with Brother at your side. And QuiltCut, easy fabric cutting for quilters.